Early on. There you go.
Okay, I think we're live. Sorry, you guys. I thought I hit the live, and of course I didn't. So Jake and I have been having this really awesome podcast episode.
Yeah, nobody will ever get to see it.
Dang it. But okay, we got our warm up in, I guess. You guys know what the deal is with Integrated. This is the podcast where we seek to grow in knowledge of our nature so that we can hopefully bridge the gap between the intellect and the will, so that we can ultimately grow as disciples of Christ, surrendering all that we are and all that we have to the truth. You might know by now that my name is Angela Erickson, but what you may not know, or hopefully you do know, is that I'm interviewing Jacob Tate from Mass of the Ages today. And I'm really excited and honored to have him on again for the podcast. So thanks for joining me again and again and again.
Yeah, no, I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, awesome. Yep, we are for sure live. So great. If you are new to Integrated, please subscribe, hit the bell. That's one thing I actually forgot to do in our warm-up run. I forgot to remind you guys to make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel, hit the bell so you get notified. And if you end up liking what you're hearing, maybe consider going on to my Patreon account and supporting my work. Margot claims she's never heard of you. Yeah,
she might wish that were true. Yeah, you guys go to Angela's Patreon. I actually just became a patron myself not too long ago, so I encourage everybody else to do the same.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I actually texted him and I told him to shut up. Like, not allowed to do that, but genuinely, like, very humbled. So thanks so much. And again, sorry for the delay on the broadcast here. So what I wanted to have Jake on to talk about today is Mass of the Ages, the different episodes that they've put out so far, what we're going to see in the future. But the core of what I want to talk about really is the discussion that's been going on, or debates, depending on how heated you've seen it. If you've been on Catholic Twitter, it's definitely a nasty debate. But, we need to have this conversation about the traditional Latin Mass and the Novus Ordo, I think. And I've seen some people sort of shy away from that debate, like the hierarchy has already made its decision. We should just live and let live, kind of a thing. But then there's another segment of Catholics saying, yeah, but like, we lost our birthright. And why is it that we're so disconnected from the saints that lived before us? So, Jake, great again to have you on, and thanks for being a part of the Mass of the Ages project. What has been, I haven't asked you this question yet, but what has doing this work, how has it impacted your Catholicism and your faith?
It's been peaks and valleys, honestly. So when I first started, it was just like this all-in effect where my wife and I are just like reading every book. And I was kind of like a liturgy enthusiast before I got involved with Mass of the Ages. So I was already interested in it. But then once it became, also work for me and a passion project, it was just like every spare minute was listening to Catholic podcasts and reading Catholic books. And my wife and I have tried to go to different Catholic churches in the area. Whenever we're out of town, we try and find a new TLM. So I think there was this kind of like excitement. And I'm a convert, and I liken it to the excitement I felt when I converted. It was like, oh yeah, this is the truth. This is the tradition all bubbling up to the top. And now I'm finally getting to experience it. But then quickly after that, and I think you touched on this a second ago, a lot of traditional Catholics then enter this stage of frustration. Like, you get excited about all the stuff that you learn and see, and then you just think, why is this hidden? Why is this so hard to find? Less than 2% of Catholics worldwide attend a traditional Latin Mass. 80 years ago, that those numbers were completely switched, right? The Latin Mass was the norm. And so then you start asking all these questions about, how did we get here? And I think the episodes very similarly mirror my spiritual journey, not intentionally. Like, I'm not the main writer on these episodes, but I'm just saying they do kind of mirror my spiritual journey on the project of, like, episode 1 is the discovery and everything is beautiful and wonderful, and then episode 2 is kind of like the frustration and what went wrong, and then what you're going to see in episode 3 is the hope, right? So what's it going to be like in the future? How can we pass on the traditional faith to our children? So I really like how Cameron kind of wrote those in conjunction with how me or anyone goes through, these kind of phases of discovery.
So what was the overall response to episode 2? Because there were some parts that were, that seemed to really emphasize and almost poke fun at the Novus Ordo, like the musical
Sure.
part. That part was okay. I personally loved it, but I did see, I did see when you posted on like Instagram, some people seem to be somewhat critical of that. And I would love to hear more about why you guys did some of the things that you did with episode 2.
Sure. So we kind of felt like you can't tell this whole story without talking about the Novus Ordo and the creation of the Novus Ordo. When we initially started out and we were just going to make one film, it was going to be very much just the tone of episode 1. Very just focused on the beauty and the reverence of the Mass, not really mentioning the Novus Ordo or things that were changed. But as we gained more support and more funding and got hundreds and hundreds of hours of footage, we realized this is a big story and people need to know about it. And the Novus Ordo is obviously part of that. Like I said, 98% of Catholics in the last 60 years have been attending Novus Ordo Mass. So it's the norm. So you can't just leave that out of this story when you're talking about the liturgy. And so, episode 1 is kind of the hook. It brings people in. It's about the beauty and the reverence of the Mass, and there's some emotional story there. And then episode 2 kind of gives you the details about, where did this go? Why is this not the common experience on a Sunday? And I don't think the intention is really to poke fun at the Mass. I mean, I attend the Novus Ordo Mass with a decent regularity. I know you do as well.
Yeah.
Some of the other guys on the Mass of the Ages team also attend the Novus Ordo Mass here and there. So I'm not somebody who's just like, hey, if you don't go to the TLM, you're a bad Catholic. Like that is never the intention here. But I do think when you see absurd things, you should call them out. And so the music section, it is fun. And, when we showed it in theaters, people did laugh. It definitely is funny. But it's not so much us poking fun at the Novus Ordo Mass as it is just laying something absurd on the table and getting people's reaction to it. Just showing, hey, this is what's going on. And honestly, we could have picked much more extreme examples, and we purposefully didn't. We didn't show bubble masses and priests riding up the aisle on the scooter because that's not the common experience either, right? So the TLM is uncommon on one side and the bubble mass, clown mass is uncommon on the other. We wanted to just use the typical experience. Like, those songs are not uncommon. And if you've been to Novus Ordo Mass, you've heard those songs. I mean,
the Gather hymnal,
yeah. The choir director at my parish calls that song the Willy Wonka song, and they sing it, right? I mean, fully knowing that it's the Willy Wonka song, right? And so we had choir directors reach out to us, and you'd think that people in choirs would be the ones who are most mad about that section.
Right.
We had so many choir directors reach out to us and say, thank you for showing that these things are ridiculous and don't belong in a place of worship, because most choir directors, and even the ones we show in the film, they're there for the right reasons, right? They want to be lifting up their hearts to God in prayer through song, and they don't want to be doing it with My Little Pony music. They want to be doing it with beautiful traditional hymns that have stood the test of time in the church. And so while it did face some criticism, more often than not, we received things that said, my eyes have been opened, or I didn't realize this was going on. Thank you for pointing it out. We've had choir directors reach out to us and say, we have now removed such and such hymn from our Sunday rotation. So the response has just been awesome. And people, regardless of what you see on Twitter, people are just so supportive. Like, honestly, that's one of my main takeaways working on this project is I've traveled all over the world going to traditional parishes, and people aren't standing around after Mass with coffee and donuts being like, the Pope is a heretic and Vatican II is terrible. Like, they're just, these churches are just filled with people who have a bunch of kids, go to work Monday through Friday, coach soccer teams, run podcasts. Like, they're just people, just normal Christians living their life. And they think that these traditions, especially the traditional liturgy, are what's best for their family. And so they're willing to fight for it. And so I think this stereotype that you see of like Novus Ordo bashing and we hate Vatican II and all of that, that was the other thing about episode 2. Like, we didn't bash Vatican II. In fact, we pointed out that a lot of the changes to the Mass run completely the opposite direction of what Vatican II called for. Yeah, so I think, I can see why people would think that we're being critical, but it's more just about pointing out the absurd and letting people draw their own conclusions.
Yeah, and I think that's, I am very pro informed consent in every aspect of life. It's really important, for example, when you're pregnant and having a child, at a hospital, you often don't get a lot of informed consent for a
Sure.
lot of things. And I think too, if abortion is going to be legal in this country, then we need to. Sorry, I have a kid that's
Oh, that's all right.
screaming at the door right now. John, honey, you're gonna have to wait a minute. Stop it. But even with like abortion, then these women, if they're going to make that quote unquote choice, we need to make sure they are fully informed so that they understand with totality what they are choosing. And of course, the people who oppose that don't want that information out there. They want the intellect to remain in darkness so that you can't make a fully informed choice, right? You're kind of cornered
Right.
into something. And I think that can be true in the spiritual life as well. I mean, there are definitely forces that would like us to remain kind of in that darkness and less tethered to the roots of our Catholic faith, tethered
Right.
to antiquity, which is the distinguishing factor of Catholicism. That's
Right.
what sets Catholicism apart from Protestantism, is that we have apostolic succession, we have the roots and the tradition that brings us together over time. What do you
It's
think about
interesting
that?
that you say that, because I'm a convert from loose Protestantism. We didn't really go to church very often, but the homeschool curriculum I was brought up in was Southern Baptist, and my dad actually recently had kind of a conversion to start going to church at a Baptist church, and so I definitely have like Protestant roots. And when I converted, what was drilled into me was, so as a Protestant, you only had the Bible, but as a Catholic, you now have Bible and tradition. And I thought that was so cool. It makes a lot of sense to me that, if everybody for 1500 years believed in the perpetual virginity of Mary, why all of a sudden did we follow this one German guy or actually, Luther actually is a bad example because he believed a lot of the Marian dogmas, but why did we all of a sudden follow these guys who just say, to heck with the last 1500 years? So when I converted to Catholicism, that was like a big pro for me. It's like I gained tradition. And then when I discovered the traditional Latin Mass, I sort of felt like it was happening all over again. It was like we had this tradition for forever. We've been celebrating this Mass for 1500 plus years. And then it all changed in the late 60s. Why? If we say that we're a traditional faith and we have scripture and tradition, why are we inventing these new things? Why are we rewriting Eucharistic prayers when the Roman canon, now called Eucharistic Prayer 1, which is optional to say at Mass, that's actually, you can make an argument that that's actually older than the canon of scripture, right? The Roman canon has been intact for a very long time. And so to just take these traditional aspects and toss them out, it is, sort of Protestant in nature to say we're just turning our back on these 1500 years.
Is my mic on? I'm like,
yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Great. So I did let the kids know they could have a snack. That's what they were screaming at me.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right. I have the same experience, actually. It's so funny because I'm a cradle Catholic, so I was raised, but I grew up going to like a Catholic light church is what I would call it.
Sure.
It was like, even in my younger church, I remember like clapping during the Gloria and, felt banners and guitars. My priest in high school actually wouldn't refer to God as being man.
I
all
had a
that
teacher,
stuff.
a nun in college, who took off points from your paper if you referred to God as a man.
No.
I lost a lot of points in that class.
Yeah. Well, it's like, why? That's his preferred pronoun. I don't get it.
Yeah.
That's super disrespectful. Okay. But that's, we need to have these conversations, I think, from those of us who are raised Catholic and feel like, oh my goodness, how did I not know about any of this? Because
Right.
I think as parents, we've sort of relegated all of our duties to other institutions in the modern world. So education is kind of expected to happen within the confines of a public school. We have our catechesis that's supposed to happen within the confines of the church. Our medical care it's all relegated to a hospital system. Hey, Rob. Thanks for coming on. All these things that normally we would do in the home in large degree, we're not even reinforcing in our homes.
Yeah,
and so
that's right.
A lot of us are growing up without that background, and we're like afraid to have this conversation about it, I think, either because we feel too ignorant or because we're told we're not allowed to question the hierarchy. And that, I think, has been a criticism for a lot of people who see or observe this debate kind of going on, especially in Catholic Twitter. It's like, why are you even bother talking about it? The decision's been made. And this is where I'd like you to talk more about the differences between the Mass being licit and valid. I think this distinction and understanding this is really, really important. And a lot of Catholics don't understand what it means for something to be licit and valid, or what it looks like when something is maybe valid but not licit, etc.
Sure. Yeah, sure. So yeah, you make a great point. I mean, we've, in the last like 60, 70 years, especially, we've relegated so much of, education in the home about anything to other people, and not always for the best. And I think most critically, we've done that with religious education. I know at my parish, we hired a new director of religious education, who's actually the person who converted me. She's my godmother and brought me into the church. And she said she'd only accept the position if we stopped doing CCD like public schools, where everybody comes in and sits in a chair for 45 minutes and they listen to a lecture on a chalkboard. She says this hasn't been effective. We need to start at the root. And so how she runs religious education at my parish, God bless her, is the families all are required to come, the whole families. And she starts at the beginning and teaches to everybody like they're a first grader, and goes through the Baltimore Catechism and reinforces these things. If the parents don't know what the sacraments are or what the Mass is, 45 minutes on a Monday night for your child probably isn't going to help. If you're not saying the rosary at home, memorizing those prayers so that you can pass a test, you're not really growing in your faith, right? So it really does start at home. And I think there's a great misunderstanding today, particularly when we have this discussion about the Novus Ordo Mass, about the validity of Mass. So I get it all the time on social media and in emails. People reach out and they say, I like this and this and this about the Latin Mass, but you can't critique the Novus Ordo Mass because it's valid. It's a valid Catholic Mass. And to that, I just say, that's a really low bar. Validity is the minimum requirement we need from Mass, right? You need to go to a Mass where the sacrament is validly confected by a validly ordained priest who's in communion with Rome. That's the minimum you need. That doesn't mean that the rest of Mass is reverent and beautiful and spiritually edifying. And there's also this idea that as long as you're receiving the Eucharist, nothing else matters, right? So I'll go to a bubble Mass or a priest riding a scooter because Jesus is there, right? There could be all kinds of liturgical abuses happening, but as long as I receive the Eucharist, then I'm good to go. And I get where you're coming from, because the Eucharist is the source and summit of Catholic life and gives sanctifying grace, and unified with Christ physically and spiritually. It's incredible. But if that was all that mattered, then on Sundays, why don't we just line up for communion? Like, why have 45 minutes of prayers leading up to communion if all that matters is reception of the Eucharist? And if all that matters is reception of the Eucharist, why does the church only require you to receive the Eucharist one time a year? This kind of attitude, almost like a fast food restaurant, like go to church and get the Eucharist and leave, is very new. And in the Eastern churches, I was talking with a Byzantine priest. The congregation doesn't receive the Eucharist every Sunday in the Byzantine church. And it used to be that way in the Western church as well. This idea of very frequent reception of Holy Communion was really championed by Pius X in the early 1900s. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I think if you are able to receive communion often, you should. But one unintended consequence of it is these arguments that you hear. Well, that Mass is valid, and I receive the Eucharist, so that's it. And it's like, well, there's a lot more to Mass than that, and there's reasons for that. So your Mass not only should be valid. I mean, a Protestant baptism is valid, right? But that doesn't mean you go to the Methodist church to baptize your baby. These distinctions matter, and some of the distinctions you look for in Mass are: is the Mass licit? Does it follow all the rubrics, right? Is a Mass fitting? Is it fittingly Catholic? Does it the ceremonies and the prayers, do they fit what you're doing, which is worshiping Almighty God in the Holy Sacrifice, where Christ the Son is offered to God the Father on behalf of all of us? And is it authentic? Is it authentically Catholic? Does it follow in the traditions of the saints and the popes? So there are these 4 qualities of liturgy, and really a lot of Novus Ordo arguments only want to talk about one, which is validity. And I'll just kind of close that by saying, Taylor Marshall often says, if somebody asked you how your marriage was and you said, well, it's valid, I don't think that would instill a lot of confidence, right? There's a lot more that goes into it. And the same is true with Mass. So we need to be able to talk about those things.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think too, we have to consider the nature of man. How God created us. He inclined our hearts to be ordered towards him and to desire beauty. So like, what is the way? That's why like our churches are beautiful, and the music is supposed to be music or like beautiful. Yeah. It's supposed to strike a chord within us to draw us heavenward. And to bring us outside of ourselves, because the Mass at the end of the day is not really about us. It's about God. And I think, for those of us who have attended a traditional Latin Mass after growing up in a Novus Ordo, it's kind of like the pressure is off of you. You go to a low Mass and you can you can be present and pray. You don't have to like know all the parts. It's not about there's a sense of humility that is cultivated because you realize, oh my goodness, this thing is happening whether I'm here or not. Sure. It's not like my active participation doesn't matter in the same way. I mean, I can participate by uniting myself in prayer in a more spiritually enriching way, because I can take time to engross myself in more contemplative prayer, which is not really possible at a Novus Ordo when you're expected to make all the responses.
Sure. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think the standard should be, what we should all be thinking about is, if we believe that Mass is the representation of Christ's sacrifice on Calvary, then we're sitting at the foot of the cross. So we're with St. John and our Blessed Mother. And, what are they doing at the foot of the cross? I like when Christ speaks his last words, does Mary have these kind of canned responses to it? The Bible tells us she's holding all these things in her heart, right? She's very quiet and contemplative. And there is kind of a sorrow there. I'm not saying that everybody at Mass should be like weeping, but you're supposed to be calling to mind that Christ gave his entire body and soul for you on the cross, and he bled out, and you're now receiving that thousands of years later. It's a very solemn thing. I mean, Sacrosanctum Concilium, the document on the sacred liturgy from Vatican II, describes the Mass as a solemn act of worship of the Blessed Trinity. So there is a solemnity to it. And I think when you add in the guitars and the clapping and all the canned responses and the shaking of hands, you just do lose some of that solemnity. So, these things can be well intentioned. Like, I'm not saying that somebody who plays guitar at Mass is a bad person. I'm sure that most of them, their hearts are in the right place. I played in the church choir for a little bit. My older sister has played in our church choir since we converted 14, 15 years ago. So your heart can be in the right place, but the rubrics and the solemnity and what the church has deemed fitting and authentic to happen at Mass matter. And I think you see in these kind of like tit for tat arguments about little things in the Mass, a Novus Ordo attendee could say, well, does it really matter if we start Mass at the bottom of the steps or if the priest starts behind the altar? It seems like a small detail. And to that, I would say, that seems sort of like a Protestant attitude. When you hear a Protestant say they don't like that Catholic churches are full of gold and that Catholic churches are very big and grand, couldn't you use that money for the poor instead? I think that kind of flies in the face of Scripture, and so we need to go back to Scripture to talk about this. There's the verse in Matthew about the woman who breaks the expensive jar of ointment on Christ's feet, right? And I think it's Judas who says, or maybe it's Matthew, but I think it's actually Judas who says that this woman is foolish and that we could have saved and sold that and used the money for the poor. And Christ rebukes him and says, no, that, you know, she's giving me my due. She's doing right by me. And I think you see there that lavishing love to Christ in the extreme, using our best talents, our best gold, our best incense, our best music, the best art that we have to offer. There's a scriptural basis for that, and not just in the New Testament. I mean, if you go back to Leviticus, holy cow, please don't tell me that God doesn't care about the details of the sacrifice. I mean, he gives those priests, when those priests are learning to offer the sacrifice of the old covenant, those rubrics, talk about strict. I mean, God wants the blood smeared on the right horn of the bull at this part of the ceremony, and only these people can be witnessing, and the smoke has to be going this direction, and the penalties for these things were death. I mean, if you didn't, like, there's the story of Uzzah, who's like helping carry the Ark of the Covenant. Do you know this story? And he reaches out, the Ark of the Covenant is on like a cart, and it bumps on the road, and he reaches his hand out to steady it. A noble intention. Nobody would say Uzzah had bad intentions by trying to prevent the ark from falling, and God strikes him dead. Like, that's the punishment for touching the ark. Right?
It's not funny, but it's like, I mean, it kind of does also go back to this whole debate about like how to receive communion, like what is the proper way to receive our Lord? Because of even touching the tabernacle, how much more so God himself? Like, and I think too, like that it really, again, it goes back to this understanding of the Eucharist being the source and summit of the Christian life. And what is the Eucharist? Who is the Eucharist? And who do we believe is present in the Eucharist? And it's like, how would that change our conduct or change how we worship him? And again, like you're saying, this isn't like a bash the Novus Ordo thing, but I think it's worth talking about. You know, I don't think we shouldn't be shying away from this conversation, but what do you say to people who are like, well, the hierarchy has already made its decision. Why not just live and let live? Like, why? I mean, we've talked about how for so many of us, we felt like our birthright was in some ways almost robbed from us. But like, what about the people who kind of know about the traditional Lat Mass and they just don't, they're not interested in it, and they prefer the Novus Ordo, and that's that.
Sure. Yeah, I think that group of people is actually much smaller than most would have you believe. Most people who I talk to, and my family actually falls into this group where they know that I do this work. They know that my wife and I have been on this journey to get the old rite sacraments for our kids, but they never come to the TLM with me. They don't see it as necessary. But when I sit down to talk to them about it, what I realize is they actually don't know the differences, right? So I think a lot of people are still stuck in the mentality. And this is what I believed for, I don't know, I guess about 10 years. So I've been Catholic about 15 years. I think about 10 of them, what I believed was that the Latin Mass was just Mass in a different language. And so, I mean, I didn't want to go to that. And I think a lot of people fall into that category, and it's an ignorance, but I don't say that as like looking down on someone, because I mean, I fell into that category too. And how could you not be ignorant about it? It hasn't been taught to us. Latin Mass hasn't been offered widely. Most priests don't know how to say it. It's not taught in seminaries. So I say ignorance, but I don't mean it in a negative way. And I think just educating people, once you sit down and you look at the TLM and the Novus Ordo side by side, it's very, very hard to not be attracted to the Latin Mass. And so what I've seen is people who actually know the differences almost universally prefer the Latin Mass. The numbers are pretty stark. Usually when you have somebody who's very quote unquote attached to the Novus Ordo and says, you know, they know about the TLM, but it's just not for them. If you dig deeper, they likely don't know as much about the TLM as they're saying they do. And that's been a very, very common experience in my work for Mass of the Ages.
So here we have Mass of the Ages, for anyone listening, is a 3-part series on the Mass. You started off kind of in episode 1, drawing us in through storytelling and kind of that memento mori mindset of like, remember your death. This is what we're ordered towards. We will all die,
That's
from
right,
dust
yeah.
we came, and to dust we shall return. But then you move into the second one. It's like, here's the juxtaposition of the traditional Latin Mass and the Novus Ordo. What can we expect from episode 3? What's that going to look like? You mentioned that it's going to leave us kind of more on a hopeful note, because when I finished episode 2, I was like crying because it was so moving. And I think the way you guys ended it was so touching and beautiful. It really struck a chord in my heart. I don't know about other people, but I did see the same comment from a lot of other people. So what can we expect as we move towards episode 3? What can you tell us?
Yeah, so what I really like about Cameron's storytelling is that it follows a very traditional story arc that we all know and love, right? It's in your favorite Disney movies, it's in your favorite classic literature, it's in your favorite musicals. And there's this kind of rise, and then towards act 2 there's a fall, and then right at the end of act 2, you get this hopefulness. We ended episode 2 was all about the kind of what's going wrong, and so I can see why people would think like, oh man, this is so heavy. But we ended on this super hopeful note with this beautiful footage of these young people worshiping at Mass, and that's where episode 3 is going to pick up. We have all of this nonsense going on politically and in the hierarchy, and it just seems like a crazy time to be Catholic. And what we're going to show at episode 3 is like this, although this is a crazy time to be Catholic and we are in the midst of a terrible crisis, the way that Catholics have lived isn't really changing. Like, you're supposed to be praying the rosary with your family, teaching your kids how to pray, getting to the sacraments frequently, living a holy lifestyle, following the precepts of the church. And I think what you see, we're titling episode 3 Guardians of Tradition, which is actually the translation of Pope Francis's Motu Proprio from last year. Traditionis Custodes means guardians of tradition. And we're going to ask the question, episode 3, who are the guardians of tradition? Who is handing on the tradition? Is it the bishops? Is it the priests? Is it the Pope? Is it moms and dads? Who is that? Who are the actual guardians of tradition? And I think we're going to inspire a lot of people and instill hope in a lot of people with episode 3 as we show you what's happening around the world. I mean, we just got back from Africa. We were filming some really incredible things that I can't say too much about in East Africa. We're traveling up to Pittsburgh soon. We've got some stuff going on in Canada, some really exciting stuff happening in Seattle. For those who follow Christine from episode 1, the widow from episode 1, she has some really incredible life updates happening. We're going to try and be there to film as much of that as she's comfortable with. So yeah, I mean, there's just so many beautiful, hopeful things happening. And we want to capture that in episode 3 and give the end of our trilogy, just give people kind of a way forward when everybody feels down. And like, episode 2 came at a providential time because of Traditionis Custodes and all these restrictions. But it also kind of feels like maybe if you stopped there, you'd get kind of stuck in that, like, everybody's against me, the mask got taken from me. And I understand that anger, but there's a way we can move forward. There's still joy and still hope in living a Catholic life. And we're going to try and capture that in episode 3. It's a big task for sure.
It is, especially at a time where I think a lot of us feel like, fatherhood has all but dropped off the planet, both physically and spiritually. A lot of us feel that our spiritual fathers have kind of absconded from their roles too. So what do you say to somebody who is feeling like, what are the things that you focus on the most when you're trying to remain hopeful at a time when it seems like we can't find a way to charitably discuss this with people? There's a lot of tension. There are people who accuse you of being a sedevecantist, or people who are, accusing you of being totally ignorant. Like, how do we approach one another with charity in our hearts, offering that hope one-on-one? Because I think that's where we're going to bring people into the beauty of the Mass as it was intended.
Yeah, so something that I have learned in kind of my traditional journey that I'm frustrated isn't really taught outside of traditional priests. Faith, hope, and love are the theological virtues, right?
Yeah.
And you don't just like wake up one day just like full of faith, hope, and love. You have to ask for it. They're gifts from God, and so you have to pray for hope. you have to be actively every day striving to be hopeful and to be optimistic and to be asking God to instill you with the theological virtue of hope. So, I mean, I would encourage everyone to pray for it, to truly to get down on your knees and talk with God and ask him to help you be hopeful. Because, you know, we might be living in a crazy time in the church, but whether you're in an amazing time in the church, or there's a lull, or you're in a crisis, you have different things going on in your family. Like, you could point to, you know, the high period of the church in the Middle Ages and say, like, oh, that must have been an amazing time to live. Well, I mean, what if your kids were dying of horrible diseases? You know, you probably weren't too concerned with the fact that you had a bunch of good bishops. And so I think you have to kind of look at your role. What's happening with your family? How can you help your parish? And so for me personally, I pray for hope, and I also just try to fulfill my role. So my role is as a father and provider for my family, somebody who tries to help out in my parish where I can, and somebody who does what Cameron asks. I mean, Cameron has this wonderful vision for Mass of the Ages, and he trusts those of us on the team to help out with certain things. And so I try to just kind of make myself available to his vision, right? I'm not an artist. I'm not a filmmaker. I don't have Cameron sees this big grand picture, and I don't know. That's not the way my brain works, right? So I try to just kind of quiet myself and listen to what he's saying the direction of this project should go. And I think that also applies in the spiritual life, right? Like, not that I'm making like a parallel between Cameron and God, but I do think that when somebody's in charge of you, or when you're looking for direction, I think quieting yourself and your instincts and just listening is a very good idea. And it's hard to do. It's particularly hard for me. I think I struggle with pride quite a bit. All of us do, but I mean, I really, that's something that I'm constantly working on. And so just kind of sitting back and focusing on my role and how can I fulfill my duty, I think is very, very prudent. I don't always do it, but I try.
Margot, and she listens to what you say.
Well, pretty soon Margot will be telling me what to do. I have no doubt.
Well, thanks again for coming on to Integrated and doing this live with me. I really appreciate it. I hope that this has kind of given people, more hope. We need more of that, and some good advice there on how to approach this time in the church, really centering ourselves in prayer and asking God to instill those virtues within us as we strive to live a life of virtue. How can people find out more of Mass of the Ages, and where can they support your work?
Yeah, we have a bunch of really awesome stuff coming up. I mean, obviously there's episode 3, but we're doing so much. We have so many short films that we want to do, huge projects coming out. We're redesigning things on our website, trying to make our Latin Mass finder even better. So if you go to latinmass.com and you click the Get Notified button, that's how you can sign up for our email list. You can also subscribe on YouTube and Twitter and Facebook, Instagram, all of that at Mass of the Ages. And then if you're interested in giving, you can go to latinmass.com/give. And we've got some different options there for monthly giving or one-time gifts. We really appreciate everyone's support. You guys have been super generous so far, and we hope that we can continue putting out products that are worth your time and your money. So we really appreciate it. And thanks so much for having me on, Angela. It's always awesome to talk to you.
Well, we'll definitely continue to have you on. Thanks everyone for joining us for this live stream on Integrated with Angela Erickson. God bless every single one of you, and I hope you have a great weekend.